Hi, welcome everybody. 6 o'clock, and welcome to the beginning of our book talk series for 2021, which may seem like deja vu all over again because our first speaker of this year is a good old friend or a friend of long standing, Donald Friedman, who has given many a talk at the Skyscraper Museum before, but this time we're celebrating his new book, which is The Structure of Skyscrapers in America, 1871 to 1900. And I'll be holding it up more, and I want to really urge you to buy this book, which is so rich in the content of materials, in the intelligence of the history, in the rich data about buildings, not only in New York, but I think it's especially in New York, but also equally in the attention that he gives to Chicago and to all the other American cities. So this is every building in the United States that was 10 stories or taller from 1871, the first buildings of that scale, to 1900. And Don has spoken a number of times before at the Skyscraper Museum, usually about the structure of metal cage construction and the evolution or shift from masonry to metal. He did that just recently in our fall series, the semester of rewriting skyscraper history, where he and Tom Leslie in particular, Tom Leslie being a historian of Chicago's skyscrapers in the same period, have had a continuing, amusing, friendly debate about the changing nature and adaptations of the structural systems in the Chicago school versus New York. But Don is the key expert on New York buildings of this period, and his expertise comes from both his research, but also his day job, which is as a structural engineer in his firm, which is called Old Structures. And he does a lot of forensic engineering. He does a lot of historic preservation. He has learned on the job through crawling through attics and basements and excavating columns in their decaying corrosion in order to understand how these buildings in New York that represent the first generation of skyscraper construction were really put together. And so this book is informed by all of that knowledge, and it was conceived a good 20 years ago as one way of telling the history from the history of the buildings, but also as he's going to illustrate tonight and to focus on the kind of changing history of the technology of construction. I asked Don to talk about that idea, which is kind of embedded in the chapters, in the early chapters of this book, about a phrase that he uses, that the modern skyscraper, the modern tall building, is the product of an industrialized process, a process of industrializing materials, but also industrializing the work site, and removing as much as possible for the purpose of profit, the amount of manual labor in the handmade buildings that represent the masonry tradition. So this book is available through the publisher's website in particular. I think you can get it other ways, but we strongly suggest that you go to APT's website, and we've provided a link for you, and we'll be sending it around later because it's the best place to buy the book, and also you can get a 10% discount before the end of this month. So you'll get a break on this by buying it directly from the publisher. Now, I will hand it over to Don, who is going to share his screen and then talk for about 40 or 45 minutes about some of these ideas that I asked him to focus on, especially tonight. And so now I want to introduce Don Friedman and get Don ready to share his screen and to read, just as I hold up the cover of the book, two quotes from the back blurbs. One is from me, and so these are very brief because I begin my much longer encomium by saying that this book is heroic and Herculean because it does represent about 20 years of work and an enormous amount of excavating of historical material. And the other quote is by Tom Leslie, who at the end of another long paragraph says that this book is a masterful and vital overview. So here is the unparalleled Don Friedman. Don.
So this all began, as Carol says, about 20 years ago. In large part because if you're interested in the way that the structure of buildings has been put together over the years, if you're interested in the history of structure, architectural history is not necessarily the place to go look for it. So it ended up that I had to do my own research in order to get the information I wanted, which can be a very long, involved process. And basically, what I've done is I've tried to not look at buildings as buildings, as architectural objects, which is of course what they are, but as collections of technologies. So any given technological object more complicated than a stone arrowhead is not one technology. It's several that are intertwined in different ways. And big buildings are collections of technologies, and that's what I want. That's the thing I really want to take a look at. This is a very early photograph, as photograph goes. This is a photograph from 1858, a construction of the Broadway Tabernacle. And this is very much, even though it's not a skyscraper, this is a good illustration of pre-industrial building construction. So this is what existed up until really the second half of the 19th century. And there are individual technologies that show up in buildings earlier than that are industrial. Cast iron starts to show up in buildings in the US in the 1830s and really gets going in the late 1840s. Wrought iron shows up maybe a decade after that. And obviously those are both industrial materials. But they don't dominate very much, and they're used piecemeal, and they're used really as replacements for other materials. Cast iron facades were replacement for stone facades. Wrought iron beams were replacements for wood girders. So the fact that those pieces of buildings were no longer traditional materials doesn't really change the way things were built. If you look at this picture, you've got a hand-powered crane up at the top. You've got a whole lot of stone and brick lying on the ground at the foot of the building. It's going to be lifted up into place. You've got a big ladder on the left-hand side here. You've got a big ladder going up, and another one over here on the right. This is the way buildings have been built literally for thousands of years. So this is 1858 in New York, and this is not very modern. Now, looking at skyscrapers, I'm looking at bigger buildings. The cutoffs I set on my research was that I was only going to include buildings that were 10 stories and taller. And I was going to include buildings where the structure was substantially complete by the end of 1900. So I've deliberately limited it to try to get just a specific group of buildings, the early skyscrapers only, before everybody had all the issues figured out. When I say that a building is a collection of technologies, you can also look at other things. You can look at building services. So if in 1858 in New York, the concept of having a reliable source of clean water was only about 15 years old. It only goes back to the Croton system. Prior to that, New York's water supply was iffy. It came and it went, and it wasn't necessarily very clean. So plumbing is something that you can examine as a building technology. 1858 is almost the same time that the first safety elevators were in use. So you can look at all these different pieces of buildings. I'm focusing on structure. Um, this is a slightly later idea. So I've, in talking about early skyscrapers, I found that there are three groups of buildings I want to discuss separately because they are physically different enough that the differences show up in how the buildings were built and in how they perform and in how they were designed. So the first is a bearing wall building. The second is a cage frame building in which there's a metal cage that supports the floors of the building, but not the exterior walls. Exterior walls are self-supporting. And in most of these buildings, the exterior wall provided lateral load resistance. In other words, when the wind blows on this building, and this is the Merchants Bank building in Brooklyn, in downtown Brooklyn, why doesn't the building tip over sideways? Well, the answer with the Merchants Bank is that it's held stiff by its exterior walls, the same way that a bearing wall building is. And then the most modern building are the skeleton frame buildings, which are the ones that people associate with skyscrapers. In a skeleton frame building, the skeleton holds up the wall. If you look at the picture on the right here, you can see that the exterior columns are entirely outboard of the floor. There's the edge of the floor, and here are the columns, and they're to the side of the floor. The columns are embedded in the exterior wall, but there are no beams in the exterior wall because you only need beams in the exterior wall if you're supporting the wall on the frame. So this is just sort of a definition. This is the late 1890s, and people are still building this sort of transitional form. Excuse me. One thing that you notice here is if you look up through the building, the way that this photographer did, the floors aren't complete. The frame is being built and the floors aren't complete. There are processes involved in building a building. So actually, let me go back to the bearing wall building here. How do you build these heavy exterior walls on this church? Well, you can see on the left here, they've got wood false work to support the arches before the arches are built. Again, this is an ancient technique. They're using wood temporarily to support things so that they can build the walls. The other thing is the roof has been started here, but you can only build so far above the walls because the walls are carrying all of the load. Any beam that's going to go in here to support the front of the roof can't be put in place until the wall here gets extended up high enough. So the pace of a bearing wall building's construction is determined solely by the walls. And that is why not very big buildings in the first half of the 19th century might take 3 or 4 years to build. It's not that people didn't want to build faster. It's that masonry construction is a warm weather process. You cannot build, or you can't build masonry properly, I should say. You can build it, but it won't be very good in the middle of the winter in New York. So if you're building this church, when it gets to be November, maybe if you're lucky, early December, you have to shut the site down in terms of the masonry. Well, if the masonry is supporting everything, that means you're shutting down all of the construction. If we look at this transitional frame, you notice that the frame is, what are we here, five levels up above where the masonry is. Because the frame is supporting the floors, you can build the floors when the wall hasn't got up there yet. And it's much faster putting the frame together than building the walls. And I'll come back to that topic a little bit later. So what happens here, why does the frame get up ahead of the walls? Because building the frame is faster. And again, the masonry still has to shut down in the winter, but the metal work does not necessarily. So you could start to see something like this. Now, what's interesting about this particular photograph is that it's showing you a construction error from 120 odd years ago. If the walls are providing all of the lateral support for the building, if the walls are what keep the building from toppling over sideways, how is it safe to have 5 levels of framing built ahead of the walls? And the answer is that it's not really. This is something that the contractor should not have been doing, but it was very easy to do because the frame was more readily built than the walls were. In the most extreme case I came across of this, building on Maiden Lane in Manhattan, the frame got ahead of the walls like this. And one day somebody said, you know, the frame doesn't look quite straight. And they measured it and it was 18 inches out of plumb. The building was just tilting over, 1.5 feet. And the contractor did what needed to be done, which was to get some cables and some winches and pull the frame back vertical. And then they built the masonry up around it, and it was held in position. So technically, what we're seeing in this picture is bad practice. But fortunately, none of the people involved are around to hear me say that. If we look at some of the details here, since you now are building this tall, relatively slender building, how do you build the masonry on the outside? And you can see here this platform, which is cantilevered out from the windows. What they've done is they've put beams through the opening where one day a window will be. And those beams are holding up some plank, and that plank is what the masons are standing on to build the wall. It's very crude. It is by our standards incredibly unsafe. You could not build that kind of platform today for masons to work on, but it functions. And this is the way you're going to build this building. This is the City Investing Building being constructed in 1907 or so. This is a skeleton frame building. And this is what we think of. This is a good example of what we think of as a skyscraper, although most people don't think of the City Investing Building because, frankly, it was a sort of awkward, not very good looking building. But these construction photographs are great because you can see everything. So in a skeleton frame building, the steel frame is holding up the floors and the exterior wall. The exterior wall is no longer structural. The frame has lateral rigidity in itself. And one way that you can see that is that we have these floors at the bottom have their exterior wall. These floors in the middle have their exterior wall, but in between there's a chunk of building where there's no exterior wall yet. And up here, they're still building steel. So obviously there's no wall there yet. This wall starting in midair is the hallmark of skeleton frame construction, the construction phase. And eventually it occurred to people that since the wall was obviously not structural in this manner, if the wall can begin at the 7th floor, then it's not serving a structural function. Then that meant that the wall didn't have to be masonry. But that's a 20th century idea that people hadn't figured that out for real yet. They sort of knew it, but they didn't quite believe it, I think. But in any case, and I'm going to sort of pick apart a picture like this a little bit later, what do we see here? Up at the top, we've got big cranes that are being used to lift up the steel. And those cranes are themselves made out of steel and engineered items. Down here, lower down, we've got these little A-frame cranes, which the masons are using, and they're much older technology. They're much more similar to what we saw in 1858 at the church. In other words, what we've got here is two different eras of technology at the same building at the same time. One is for the time, very modern steel frame construction, and the other is the much older masonry construction. And they're going on at the same site, literally in contact with each other, but there's nothing relating them beyond that. In terms of schedule, the wall has been completely decoupled from the structure of the building. There's no longer any relationship. You can build the entire frame and then come back and build the entire wall. You can do the two simultaneously, as we're seeing here, but not in sync. Or you could go floor by floor, keep the masonry going with the steel if the masons could work that quickly, which is unlikely. So there's no longer any real relationship between the two pieces of the building. We have here, again, some platforms for the masons to stand on. What's interesting is they're no longer cantilevered from the interior the way they were at the Mechanics' Bank just a few years earlier. So this fringe here that you see, those are outriggers. Those are small temporary beams sticking out, and they're carrying cables, and the cables carry the mason's platform. Why would you do that? I mean, you still have the beams cantilevered out from the buildings. Why would you switch to these outriggers and cables, which is a more complicated system than just supporting the mason's platforms directly? And the answer is that this is adjustable. You can shorten these cables, and you can therefore raise these platforms to any height from where it is up to almost to the outriggers. Whereas the cantilevered beams sticking through the window openings that were used earlier only worked at the level they were at. So you could build that once per floor, but you couldn't do that continuously the way you can do this. So this is a construction technology. This has nothing to do with what the building will look like when it's completed, but these outriggers are a way to, again, decouple the masonry construction from what's going on inside. If the mason's platform here can be supported for 1, 2, 3, looks like 5 floors off of cable, then you no longer need to have anything on the inside related to the mason's work. So this is separating the building into pieces. It's a little bit hard to see in this photograph. I think the next photograph shows it. Hold on one second. No, we'll come back to that. You can see piles of brick in here, and there'll be photographs that are blow-ups where you'll see it better. But these piles of materials, this is the masons, if you're building a low-rise bearing wall building like a church, you just put all of your masonry materials on the ground next to where you're working, and you lift them up to where you're working. If you're building a 30-story building, that's not a very effective way to do things. So what they're doing is they're lifting the materials from the ground, storing them on the inside of the building, and then using them as needed. And there's material stored up here as well. Again, it looks like the top 4 or 5 floors here are just bare steel. They do not yet have floors. So what you've got is pure steel construction up at the top. Nothing else is going on. Then you've got the floor construction going on here, where they're installing the terracotta tile arch floors that provide the floors of the building, the floor structure of the building. And then lower down still, you've got the masonry wall construction. So it went from being 2 technologies, now there are 3. You've got a 3rd stage with the floors. The title of the slide actually shows up, I think, on 3 or 4 slides. I can't emphasize this enough. This is the Flatiron Building, 1903. This is, I believe, this picture is from 1905. And if you look at the street traffic, you've got some streetcars here on 23rd Street, but everything else is horse-drawn. So yes, automobiles existed in 1905, but if you look at sort of a typical street scene at Broadway and Fifth Avenue, you're seeing horse-drawn vehicles. So you've got the very modern structure of the Flatiron Building, surrounded by much older technology for transportation. Technology of a building, if we just look at that, 1900 to 1910, so the era of the Flatiron Building, the era of the City Investing Building from the last slide. You've got modern steel frames that honestly are very similar to the steel frames we build today. We use higher strength steel now, we use bolts instead of rivets, but the basic concept of the steel frame has hardly changed in over 100 years. The way we design it has changed. We now have computers. It means we can do certain types of analysis that were not feasible with hand calculation. But the structure by this period was basically, it was developed to a point where we would accept it today. What were the inside of the buildings like? Well, the buildings have tile arch floors, which we wouldn't accept today for structure because they're not very resilient, for example, in earthquakes. And New York does have seismic loading in design since 1996. So even though a tile arch floor, they work fine, they're in a lot of old buildings in New York, we would no longer use them. We consider them to be not adequate for how we see buildings today. The building has exterior masonry walls, which are sort of in between. They don't quite meet modern code requirements, but they're actually very good for waterproofing. You sometimes have to convince people of that. The lighting standards in these buildings are terrible by modern standards. The Flatiron Building had electric lighting from day one, but the amount of lighting was too low by our standards. The only ventilation was by opening a window. The only heating was steam heat. So the different technologies of the building are sort of good to different degrees. You are not going to find a skyscraper of this era, a pre-1910 skyscraper, with entirely original elevators. They're simply They don't meet our expectations for what the elevators in a tall building have to be. The cabs may be original, but the control system will not be, because people want modern elevators. You are unlikely to come across a modern skyscraper where the interior still has the original lighting, again, because it's just not bright enough by our standards. So this issue that building technologies move at different speeds matters for early skyscrapers, because people focused on the structure, which is why the structure developed first. And it wasn't just the people focused on it, they had a place to take it from. The structure of these buildings is very much a product of railroad bridge technology. And that is looking at who the engineers were, how the steel was designed and detailed and fabricated. All of that comes from the heavy steel bridges that were being constructed at the same time in this country. That's where the engineering expertise came from. Whereas if you look at something like electric lighting, that was developing almost simultaneously with tall buildings. And therefore, there wasn't sort of an existing pool of expertise and production to take from. This chart is the core of my talk, and I'm going to spend a couple of minutes going through it. First thing that's very important is that all of the things I'm talking about here have been converted to indexes where I take 1870, in one case 1880, as 100. So in other words, I've divided these things by the 1870 value to get rid of units and to get rid of the magnitude of the number. And the reason for that is that these things, the numbers vary widely. If I want them on the same chart, I need to do that. The lowest number here would be the Chicago population in 1870, which is around 300,000. The highest number that's on this chart is brick production in 1890, which is more than 8 billion. Very difficult to show 300,000 and 8 billion on the same chart, but if you convert them to an index, you can. So let's just sort of show what's going on here. Why do I think this chart is so important? If you look at the blue line that's second from the bottom, that's the United States population. It doesn't quite double between 1870 and 1890. It goes up by about 85%, I think it is. So that's quite a bit of growth in 30 years. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody that the United States population grew rapidly between 1870 and 1900. New York City's population more than doubles, not very much more, but slightly more than doubles. I should mention that there's a quirk here. In 1898, New York swallowed up Kings County, the western half of Queens County, and Richmond County, having already swallowed up what's now Bronx County in the earlier 1890s. If I include Brooklyn, what happens is that the New York population really jumps at 1898. It goes from 1.8 million to 3.4 million. But that's a sort of a misleading thing. So when I say New York City population, I'm using the New York City boundaries as they existed in 1895, which is Manhattan and the Bronx. The Bronx was not very heavily populated back then, so it doesn't skew things all that much. In terms of population, the big growth is Chicago, which is not quite 6 times as great in 1900 as it was in 1870. That's not much of a surprise. Chicago was starting from a much smaller starting point, and it was growing quite rapidly. In absolute numbers, New York grows more than Chicago does. In percentage, Chicago grows 3 times as fast. So that's population. I don't think there's any great surprises there. Let's discuss something about construction for a minute. So this yellow line at the bottom is new building permits, and that doesn't include every building in the country, because in unincorporated areas, in small towns, there may not have been a permit, but it includes the construction in major cities. And what you'll notice is that it doesn't grow all that much between 1870 and 1890, and it goes down and up and down and up. It's not really growing. Compare that to this red line here, which is construction cost. Construction cost between 1870 and 1890 goes up 3 times. doesn't change all that much between 1890 and 1900. It goes up a bit, but not very much. But that's a lot of growth in construction cost, while the number of new buildings isn't necessarily increasing all that much. And one question that comes up is, how does that happen? And there are sort of two mechanisms. One is that buildings are getting bigger. That would mean that each building is more expensive than it was before. The other is that buildings are getting more expensive per square foot. It's also possible, of course, that buildings were getting both bigger and more expensive per square foot. Why would buildings get more expensive per square foot? Fancier mechanical systems is one possibility. Fancier elevators, fancier plumbing. In 1870, a large proportion of buildings in the country would have been private houses that wouldn't necessarily have had indoor plumbing. In 1900, private houses would have had indoor plumbing. So there are reasons that, if you look at the entire population of buildings in the United States over these 30 years, there are reasons that buildings would get more expensive. But one thing that is driving this is the cost of large buildings in downtown areas. I should also mention, by the way, all of this data is coming from census data. And if anybody is interested in the Q&A about exactly where I got these numbers from, I'd be glad to talk about it then. So that's construction of new buildings. Now comes what I consider to be the best part of this. Let's discuss individual technologies that go into new buildings. So something that's not necessarily new buildings, general manufacturing production. And that's that purple line there. It is nice, steady growth. It increases 4 times over in this 30 years. That is, this 30 years is a critical portion of the United States becoming an industrial power. It kicks off before 1870, but the end of the 19th century is when we really, as a country, pulled even with or ahead of nations in Europe. If you look at brick production, which is the upper light green line, it goes up, it peaks in 1890 and then actually goes down a little bit, and it doesn't go up all that much. For example, it goes up significantly less than construction cost does. But that's not the line that catches my eye. The light blue line here, structural iron and steel for buildings only. Why does that line not extend back to 1870? Because prior to 1880, the Census Bureau didn't bother to break out iron and steel for buildings because it wasn't enough to bother worrying about. There are other iron and steel numbers, just iron and steel production, iron and steel for railroads. And prior to 1880, those two numbers, general iron and steel production and iron and steel for railroads, are almost the same thing. Not exactly, but very close. But starting in 1880, iron and steel production for buildings takes off, and in 20 years increases over 9 times. You also later on get iron and steel being used for other purposes, automobiles, for example. So what happens here, if you think about construction cost increases, brick production does not very much, or does not as much, and the number of new buildings doesn't change very much. So this is sort of implying that iron and steel are becoming more prominent in building use, which I think is not a big surprise to anybody who's interested in skyscrapers. These are sort of cartoons of buildings. For those of you who saw my talk in the spring semester, I used this slide, I used the next slide, but I want to talk about them in a slightly different way now. So these are model buildings that I created some time ago to look at the cost and the pieces of buildings that were required. And these are very simplified models. I assume that the building is 60 feet by 60 feet. So this is 3 20-foot bays wide, and it's 60 feet out of the plane of the screen. I didn't worry about stairs. I didn't worry about elevators. I didn't worry about mechanical systems. I took windows into account only as a hole in the wall. I didn't worry about windows themselves. I didn't worry about interior finishes or any of that. I was looking only at the structure of the building. So that is masonry, iron, and steel. I also didn't look at foundations particularly. And assuming that these buildings are in New York, there is a required size of the wall, and that's what this diagram shows, is the required wall thickness by building code. There was no option about this. I mean, you could push that volume of brick around, but you couldn't get rid of it. This is a bearing wall building on the left. This is a cage frame building in the middle with cast iron columns supporting steel beams. The wall got thinner, but it still increased in thickness from top to bottom. And then on the right, the same building architecturally with skeleton frame building. Now, first of all, just in general terms, the cage frame and the skeleton frame are more usable buildings because they don't have these two big interior bearing walls. I assume that those interior bearing walls had quite a few doors in them, but they're still an annoyance and they still interfere with most office use, which is actually one reason why bearing wall buildings continued in use in hotels and apartments longer than they did in office buildings and industrial buildings. You could design a hotel around this 20-foot module, in other words, including the walls, and only the hallway had to have openings in those interior bearing walls. So just giving a general sense of a 12-story building built using the three different structural systems that were popular in 1900 or 1895. And this is based on those models, how much material goes into the buildings. And it occurred to me a couple of days ago that this is actually slightly misleading in a way, but it's misleading in a way that makes my point even stronger, I think. So how much brick is in the building? Well, the bearing wall building has almost twice as much brick as the cage frame building because it has those big walls that are required by code. And going from the cage frame building to the skeleton frame building, you save a bit more because the walls get thinner. The biggest change here from bearing wall to cage frame is because you got rid of the two interior walls. You only have cast iron in the cage frame building, and that's in the columns. The steel in the bearing wall building are the floor beams, and steel in the cage frame building are floor beams. And then in the skeleton frame building, it's floor beams and columns. So the cost of brick, the cost of cast iron, and the cost of steel. And if you add up these numbers, your building is getting cheaper by moving away from bearing wall construction. I said this is slightly misleading. So this is the weight of the material in tons, but steel is 3 times as dense as brick is. So if you look at this as how much material in volume, cubic feet of material, instead of going down by whatever that is, 70%, it actually, it's going to go down by more like 90%, the volume of material. You're replacing a huge volume of brick with a relatively small volume of steel. Brick is, even in 1870, it's produced in an industrial process. The days of hand-molded common brick were long gone by 1870. But putting it in place is brick by brick. A mason stands there with a trowel and puts each brick in place with mortar. And to be fair about it, that is still what we do today. That is still how we build brick today. We have not, for better or worse, and you can argue this point, but we have not removed the individual hand labor for each brick that is required to build a brick wall. How many bricks are in this building? That 4,900 tons is approximately 1,600,000 bricks. This is a 12-story, 60-foot by 60-foot building. It's not a big building. It's got over 1.5 million bricks in it. And you think about hand labor, even if your masons are extremely skilled and move quickly, that is a lot of bricks to set by hand. The skeleton frame, the steel pieces are fabricated off-site, and they come to the site already ready to be riveted together. So you have rivet crews putting these pieces together. You have crane crews putting the pieces in place. There's a lot of labor involved here, but compared on a pound by pound basis, or a volume by volume basis, 1 cubic feet of brick, which is about 20 bricks, versus 1 cubic foot of steel, which would be an ordinary floor beam, maybe 4 or 5 feet long. There's just no comparison. The amount of labor to build the brick wall is much, much higher, and that's reflected in the costs. The costs of the materials, as I have here, are based on cost data from the 1890s. about what it costs to build so much of a wall or so much of a steel frame. And on a per pound basis, steel is much cheaper because of what it is, because it's not being put together with individual hand labor on site. Yes, driving rivets is hand labor, but it's because of the industrial nature of this. You're dealing with connecting pieces that have been fabricated. I mean, the steel is rolled in a mill. It's fabricated in a shop, possibly connected with the mill, possibly not, brought to the site, and then it just has to be assembled. So there is a huge change in the technology that is reflected in the cost. And when you look at a skyscraper, you know, we don't necessarily care overall how it was built, right? I mean, if you look at a skyscraper today, you're not going to say that one building is better than another because of how it was built, because how it was built ended before the building was occupied. But we will look at this in terms of how did these things develop? Why did people want to go away from bearing wall buildings? Well, one reason is that bearing walls had to be very thick. And my model building, 12 stories tall, had 32-inch thick walls. Well, a lot of windows in that era were 3 feet wide. A 3-foot wide window and a 32-inch thick wall is starting to develop a sort of a tunnel effect. It's not that nice. But if you can build that same building with 12-inch thick walls, because it's a skeleton frame, you've improved the experience of the building. But you can't get there. You can't get that better experience without the technologies. So what this table is telling me is that there was a reason people wanted to move to steel frame buildings. They were less expensive. And you can use the money you've saved. If you look at the bottom line here, the structural cost goes, oh, sorry about that. Oops. Structural cost goes from $2.11 down to $1.28 per square foot. You can use that 90 whatever cents you've saved, or 80 whatever cents you've saved. You can use that in other ways. You can use that for nicer elevators. You can use that by build some more floors. You can use that money for something else. So by switching to a steel frame building, it physically enables you to build taller. It's a better technology for building taller, but it also gives you more options. So back to the city investing building. If you see right there and right there on the sides, those big beams, those very big beams are transfer girders. There's a column coming down that has to transfer. Basically, the corner here is chamfered architecturally, so you get a rounded corner, whereas down at the base of the building, it's squared off. Same thing on this side. There's a square corner at this floor, and then a chamfered corner above. So you have a column coming down with nothing below it. Now, first of all, you can't even do this in a bearing wall building or a cage frame building. This is an architectural feature that is enabled by the use of steel frame technology. So this is a good example of people are using steel frame technology to get, when I say a better building, a building more in line with what they want. Again, you've got the big derricks erecting steel at the top. You've got these little A-frame cranes for the masons at the bottom. You've got piles of material. That is a huge pile of brick or terracotta. I'm not sure which right there. Another pile here, another pile here, another pile here. This stuff up here, I believe, is for the floors. This is terracotta for the floors. So what you're seeing here is you can build the structure of the building cheaply and quickly by using the modern technology. And then you still have to use this older technology. Where does the story go in the long run? People looked for ways to get rid of the masonry wall because that was the last place you had to have masons. And that leads us after World War II to the glass and metal panel curtain wall. As I'm going to show you some slides in a moment, people want to get rid of building tile arch floors. And I have two photos I want to show of that. But they want to get rid of that because, again, the tile arch floors had to be built hand by hand, piece by piece. Whereas once you went to a concrete floor, you could remove some of that individual hand labor. Here's a picture later on in construction. This is the Singer building in the background under construction. It's not part of city investing. And you get a sense here of the extent of the steel frame construction. There's a whole bunch of cranes up here. And that right there is very interesting. That is two of the columns and the beams connecting them at the corner. Here's the same thing on this side. This is something that you can do with steel framing because the steel is stable by itself as you're assembling it. You can cantilever up a whole section like this without fear it's going to break off and tip over. You couldn't do this with cast iron columns. You certainly couldn't do this with masonry walls. If you built a 3-story high masonry wall like that, you would expect it to not be stable. So this is people learning how to take advantage of the technology they're using. And again, this is technology that at this point, 1907, it was less than 20 years removed from being something used only for bridges. They're learning how to use it in building buildings. And the more they learn about how to do this kind of thing, the faster they get, and therefore the cheaper they get. And it's a huge push towards this kind of construction. If it were not cheaper, people wouldn't be doing it. And if you could find a way to make it cheaper still, you could build taller, you could build more, whatever you want to do with the savings, but it all works out as to your advantage. Again, we have the outriggers here supporting the mason's platform here, mason's platform here, outrigger here. So what you're seeing here is City Investing was a very large building in plan. Its footprint was very large. And as a result, you have different paces going on. These two wings are about the same stage. This wing over here is a little bit behind. It's okay. It doesn't hurt you any because you can do that. You can have different pieces moving at different speeds and it doesn't matter. This is the cover of a terracotta company catalog. And there it is. Here's your tile arch floor in the background. That orange is the tile arch floor. And here's a laborer carrying one of the pieces of terracotta to set in place. And putting aside the fact he's not lifting properly, this is not really accurate. You wouldn't have one guy like this carrying one piece, but this is accurate in the sense that each separate piece of terracotta, and each piece was roughly 16 inches square, had to be carried by hand and put in place. This is fragile material. You couldn't just throw it around. So if you wanted to build your floors quickly, the only thing you could do was add more laborers, and at some point that doesn't work because they start to run into each other. So this is in the 19-teens, a fireproofing company showing you the way they thought of themselves, and it is a mason carrying one piece of terracotta. Roughly the same era, this is what replaced terracotta tile arch floors. This is a draped mesh slab floor, building at 23rd Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. And what you're seeing here is those are the tops of the steel beams with wire mesh laid over them, and then concrete would be placed over that. What you're seeing at the top here, that's the wood forming for the floor above. You still need to build all that wood formwork, which is a problem that it took until the 1950s for people to figure out a way to get rid of that wood. But the most important thing here is that, again, a lot of the difficult labor of assembly has been moved off site. The tile arch floor, each piece of terracotta has to go in by itself into the floor, sitting on that form. With the draped mesh floor, the wire mesh, which is the critical element, is made in the factory. And it came out to the site in very large rolls, and the lathers just unrolled it on top of the form. So moving the skilled labor from the construction site to the factory is part of industrialization. It's a huge savings in terms of cost and time on site. Overall cost and time, maybe not, but on site is what matters in the construction process. Even today, the more prefabrication you can do off site, the faster and generally less expensive your building is. So this is one small step in that direction. So I've just given you sort of two examples, the switch from brick walls to steel frame and the switch from tile arch floors to drape mesh floors, which is actually an intermediary concrete floor, and then concrete on metal deck starts in the 1950s. These are all examples of using more highly stressed, analytically designed elements in lieu of previous empirically designed masonry. Nobody ever designed the masonry walls in those bearing wall buildings. There were rules in the building code, and those rules pretty much make sense, but they do not allow for analytic design of the walls. Whereas you could only build a steel frame if you analyzed it. And we can today quibble about the analytical tools that engineers used then, but for the most part, they make sense. Similarly, the tile arch floors can be analyzed as arches, but never were. They worked, people used them. Whereas a drape mesh floor, you have to size the mesh for the load. So there's an analysis process there. So the overall trend in buildings, and this has been going on now since the 1870s. So let's say for something on the order of 150 years, has been replacing bulk, undesigned traditional materials with highly stressed, less material that is highly stressed and is designed. And it has happened in structure, to the frame, to the floors, to the curtain walls. It's also happened in other portions of the building, non-structural portions of the building. So when Carol says I talk about industrialized structure, that's what I'm trying to get at. Thank you, and let's take questions.
Thanks, Don. Well, you ask your own questions and then you answer them. So no one wants to interrupt with something as trivial as a question that isn't as fundamental as the principles that you were talking about here. Let me ask one, and then I have notes on two that were contributed by the audience that are rather more specific. But my question has to do with savings in time. Because you showed us the buildings may have gotten more expensive even as they were simultaneously economical in their structure. How was the savings in time from these industrialized processes? How would you value that in the overall equation?
Well, I'm going to start by saying something that I know you know, but that everybody in the audience may not, which is that speeding up construction saves money in itself because a lot of buildings are built using construction loans. And while a building is a construction site, it's not making any money. So if you can build faster, it saves you money right there. To give an example of it, the old General Post Office at the foot of City Hall Park, where Broadway and Park Row, I believe took 4 years to build. And yes, it was a complicated building, but it wasn't that complicated. It took 4 years to build because there was a lot of masonry construction and a congested site, and they happened to have bad winters when they were building that building. By 1900, people were building buildings of roughly the same footprint, but instead of 5 stories tall, 20 stories tall in a year, sometimes in less than a year. So there is a huge increase in speed of construction. Again, think about the change in the volume of brick. If you can build your steel frame in any weather, so the steel frame can go up continuously, and you've reduced the volume of masonry work by 70%, it's much easier to do your masonry work in one warm season if there's so much less of it. So the change from bearing wall to skeleton frame, the overall change, is a huge change to speed up construction, even if we ignore efficiencies in steel framing. In other words, I was talking about how people were learning to build better in steel. Even if we ignore that, the thing that is slowest is building the walls, and you've greatly reduced the volume of that.
The questions are coming in fast, and we're running out of time. We'll take maybe two or three before we conclude. And one of the ones that was just asked is about your sources, which you said you might discuss. Someone is very impressed with your number crunching and wonders where all the numbers came from.
So the Census Bureau collects enormous amounts of data beyond just the census of people in the country. They've been collecting data on industry going back almost to the beginning, almost to the first census. They've had pieces of that. And every so often they publish an analysis of the non-population data. And most of the numbers in that graph came from the 1957, it was up to 1957, census on, I'm trying to remember what they called it. Hold on one second, maybe, I should be able to pull up that. The historical data abstract to 1957, and they had that's where the numbers on steel production came from. That's where the numbers on industrial production came from. Basically, everything but the population of the country, New York and Chicago, came from that abstract from 1957. And the nice thing about looking at numbers, from the 19th century is that whatever was true in 1957 is still true today, because the 19th century has not changed in the last 70 years.
One of the questions had to do with the technology of bolts versus rivets. And another one of the questions, I suppose, similarly, was interested in how masonry buildings might be added on their upper stories with a lighter frame construction. So maybe you could kind of combine those.
Okay, so bolting has been used for metal since the very beginning, but the bolts that were used for cast iron, let's say, didn't give you a very tight connection. They hold the pieces in place, but the pieces can still move a little bit. There's a little bit of slop. Rivets provide a very good connection. Rivets are driven hot, and as they cool, they clamp down. So if you drive a rivet, let's say you have two pieces of metal, each a half-inch thick, you drive a rivet through there, red hot, the shaft of that rivet is 1 inch long. As the rivet cools, it tries to shrink, but it can't get less than 1 inch. So what happens is it clamps the two pieces together, and that gives you a very strong connection. In the mid-20th century, the research started in the 1930s, but wasn't really used until the 1960s. People developed forms of bolts that could give you the same clamping action. Basically, you deliberately tighten the bolts to the point where they're clamping the metal together. And those are the bolts we use today. People usually refer to them as high strength bolts, which is slightly misleading, but whatever. So starting in the 60s, people started using high strength bolts instead of rivets. And sort of on a one-to-one comparison, they're very similar. The bolts are slightly stronger, but it's not enough to matter. The difference is that a riveting crew is 6 people and a bolting crew is 2 people. So the big reason that bolting drove out riveting was that it was cheaper. Again, change in technology caused by cost.
And building additional floors on a masonry base. And another question just came in about masonry facades, their role in fireproofing. Was that something that was a trade-off?
Well, okay, that's a very easy one. So I'll do that and I'll go back to building on top. The masonry was used for fireproofing straight up through the 1950s. And basically when the walls got to be too thin to provide fireproofing in themselves, people just built masonry piers around the columns. So you would see a terracotta enclosure for a column that was set up against the back of a facade. And if you go into a pre-war apartment house, or as I was today in a pre-war loft building, you'll see those terracotta enclosures around columns. So the terracotta catalog I put up, National Fireproofing Company, people thought of terracotta as a fireproofing material, and it was used specifically for that. In terms of building a frame on top of a bearing wall building, you can do it, and it has been done, and I have done it. So I'm not going to say it's a mistake. The problem with it is that by modern standards, it's very difficult to analyze a bearing wall building for lateral load. It can be a big bearing wall building, and a lot of them built in the 19th century or the early 20th century don't work by our standards today. In other words, if I try to analyze, what's a good example? Some of the 1900 era apartment houses on the Upper West Side for lateral load, they don't work. Now, empirically, I know they do work. So I trust the fact that those buildings have been standing through all of the windstorms since the day they were built to today. But if I can't show it analytically, I can't build an extension on top. So a lot of times those things get canceled because of that kind of problem. Also, again, since 1996, we have seismic design in New York, and it's pretty much impossible to show that those buildings as they exist work for seismic loading. If you put on too big an expansion, you're going to trigger the need for seismic analysis. So it's doable, but it's difficult.
We have now quite a few technical questions, and I see at least one of them is imploring you to answer an individual question if someone can contact you later. What I would suggest, and seems appropriate because we're just past our hour, is that people buy your book first or buy Historical Building Construction, consult that as the reference. And if you don't find the answer to the question there, then you can ask Don about that. And maybe he'll write you another book in order to address just those particular questions you have. So we are going to send around a thank you for listening to the people who signed up, and some 90 some people attended, but some people will have not had the opportunity to hear this terrific talk. And we have recorded this, so we'll be putting it on our website so that you'll be able to, and as well as our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to listen those again and again. And we are also sending around the follow-up email that will give you the link to the APT website so that you can find a discount for the book, as well as purchase it there and support their important historical efforts to bring history to a much broader audience, which I hope can also be said to the Skyscraper Museum, and it can certainly be said about Don Friedman. So thanks, Don. See you soon. We won't wait for another chapter, but we'll supply you with a lot more questions and sure, see what that produces. Thanks so much, everybody. Join us next time. Actually, I should give a plug for next Tuesday night. So pretty much every Tuesday night through the beginning of May, we have a program, but we're going to be alternating between our usual book talks and a series that we call Worldview, that is in conjunction with our Super Tall exhibition, and which has invited architects, structural engineers, and building industry experts, especially about construction and constructability. So we're going to see the 21st century bracket to the history that Don has helped us both remember and illustrate and understand tonight. So come back then, look on our website, and you can RSVP there for the list of schedule of lectures. And we hope to see you every Tuesday night. So take care, everybody. Bye. Bye, Don.
Bye.